grief doesn't just come when somebody dies. It comes when, as there's a change and there's a deterioration in health. I think for carers, we call it anticipatory grief. So grief isn't just after somebody dies, but also grief is attached to the feeling that you are losing aspects of the person or the relationship, maybe aspects of your own life.
Hi everybody, good morning. I'm Jan Draper and I'm working with DCC as a coach and facilitator, and welcome this morning to everybody that's joined us. So without further ado, for this morning's session, which is around grief, bereavement and identity, I'd like to hand over for a few seconds to my colleague, Dr. Gemima. Gemima, would you like to tell us a bit about you and what we're going to be discussing in today's wellness session?
Yeah, thanks, Jan. So yes, my name's Gemima and I'm a clinical psychologist, and I've been working with Dementia Carers Count since 2017. So for a few years now, I'm really involved in the psychological support and the resilience aspect of some of the courses. And it's just really nice to be a part of it. My doctoral research was around resilience, but I've also worked for years in palliative care and bereavement. And I still do now. So I've got a real interest in this subject today, particularly, and how it affects carers.
Thanks, Gemima. So as always, please do send us in any questions that you have. Please type them into the chat box and we'll try and get around to answering them in the half hour that we've got. Please bear with us because it's not always easy to respond to every question, especially when multiples come in at once. If you prefer to send in an anonymous private message, that's absolutely fine. And if we don't get around to answering your question during the live session today, then we'll get some time at the end to respond to you direct. So please don't worry about that and don't think your questions will go unheard. They certainly won't. So Gemima, when we think about grief, bereavement or identity, one word that seems to be woven through all of them, it seems to be that of loss. What's your take on that?
Yeah, definitely. As human beings, loss is a huge part of our lives, even from childhood. We've all experienced losses. And that doesn't have to be bereavements. Bereavements are when somebody actually dies, but loss affects us in so many ways as we go through our life. And as human beings, it's part of our makeup is that we have to come to terms with loss and we have to adjust to it. But it can be really hard. And loss is attached to so many different things in life. Any sort of period of transition in life can be a loss or has losses attached to it. So, for example, even when those transitions are positive, so you might be about to move house, that's a positive, you might really want to move house, it might be a good thing. But also in the transition to the new house, you've also got to say goodbye to the old house. And that can be, and all the memories and the time that you spent there. So that's a loss. Even when you were a child, if you remember going from your primary school or your middle school up to secondary school, and you might be really excited about that. You might also be nervous about it. But you've got to say goodbye to your old teachers and your old school. And some people find, those sort of saying goodbye things and losses harder than others, but it affects us all in different ways. And so it's really important that we kind of start this session by thinking about loss and how we've all coped with loss throughout our lives, and as a carer, you are, we'll look at this in a few minutes, but you are coping with loss right now. But also you will have been through a lot of losses. Some of those maybe have been bereavements in your life, which are especially challenging, but also there will have been other losses. And so it's really important that we look at how we cope with loss in general and how we've coped in the past to help us manage how we're coping now.
Yeah, that's so important, isn't it? So you mentioned about transitions, and every transition or even a change, it's something about leaving go of what's gone behind and looking forward to what's coming ahead, isn't there? And it's that leaving go before you can almost move on.
Yeah. And sometimes, you know, as is the situation often with carers at the moment, there it isn't a positive transition. Maybe it's something you're not happy about, and it's not something you really want to move into. But the reality is that we have to find ways of coping and adapting and moving forward. So it is so challenging. And so this session today, we just really want to talk about the subject of loss, bereavement, grief, identity, and just look at how that can affect us and what we can do to try and help ourselves through it.
Yeah, we've had a comment in from Catriona, and she says that the sense of loss she felt once her dad no longer recognised her. And she said that was almost equal to the loss that she felt when he died. So it was almost like she lost him twice. And she never thought that you could actually grieve for somebody whilst they're still with you before they've died. She always assumed grief was post-death, and actually that was a wake-up call for her, because she almost felt she'd lost him whilst he was still around, but he didn't know who she was anymore.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, we'll talk about that. I mean, I think in terms of you know, that situation for, say, Catriona, obviously that's really tough, and often we think, you know, thinking about carers now, carers often are experiencing, as I've already said, they experience loss. If you think about you know, the situation that, you know, for people who are listening now, that they're currently in, that they may well be experiencing loss in so many areas of their lives. So some of that will be loss around maybe their relationship with the person with dementia. Maybe things have changed and you really miss how things used to be. And, you know, for example, if it's your mum or your husband, or, you know, things that you used to talk about, certain things that you just don't feel you can connect with on the same level. So in Catriona's case, you know, that of course that she's experiencing loss as she goes through this, and that feeling that she's experiencing, which is dad no longer recognizes her. That is so, of course there's going to be grief associated with that. So that feeling of grief doesn't just come when somebody dies. It comes when, as there's a change and there's a deterioration in health. I think for carers, you know, we call it anticipatory grief. So grief isn't just after somebody dies, but also grief is attached to the feeling that you are losing aspects of the person or the relationship, maybe aspects of your own life. You know, I don't know, in Catriona's case, but in many carers' cases, saying, you know, I used to love my job, but now I've had to give up work, or I've had to let go of some of the hours that I was doing, or I'm not able to see my friends like I used to, or I don't feel like me anymore. And that's that loss of identity. And so there's so much loss associated often with becoming a carer of somebody with dementia, and people often don't realize that what they're experiencing, the emotions they're experiencing, are grief. And if somebody has died, we're very good often at knowing or guessing why that might affect us. But often when it's anticipatory grief, so in Catriona's case, like that feeling of dad doesn't recognize me and that feels awful, we don't tend to look after ourselves in the same way, because we don't tend to think, oh, I'm grieving and I need extra TLC.
Absolutely. We've had a couple of comments in the chat box, Gemima, more comments of advice and support really to others listening than questions. But Jen has said that it's really important to try and maintain some sort of social life, even if it's just staying in touch with somebody via a phone call. She said she didn't do that, and presumably that means she sort of let go of some of her friends for a while. But she's saying that because she didn't do that, it's now difficult to sort of rebuild her social life. And Samantha similarly is saying she took time off work to care for her mum, but the staying in touch days really helped her to stay connected. So I think it's that importance of getting that, it's that support network. What's your support network, isn't it, really?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. And that's another type of loss, isn't it, when you've lost aspects.
Yeah.
The saying, taking time off work. I mean, thankfully Samantha was able to do those keeping in touch days at work. That's really important if that's possible, if you're planning to return again. So that's great that she did that. And also for Jenna, just saying, that her social life, it's so important. And maybe the social life has to look different. Maybe you can't do, perhaps you can't do what you did before, but if you are able to find ways of connecting and talking, whether that's over the phone or grabbing a quick coffee, that's great. And I know lots of carers say it's not possible, or I feel people are treating me differently, and that can be really, really hard, really hard.
It can, but almost I kind of wonder whether the keeping in touch thing, that if they keep in touch, at least people are used to speaking to you. But there's something about if you kind of lose that contact, when you do maintain the contact again, how uncomfortable people perhaps could be around you, and that again could make it difficult for you as an individual, couldn't it?
Yeah, it's really important to try and find somebody, that you're safe people that you feel you can trust, but it's hard at work. I know it is. So I feel for them.
Absolutely. We've just received an anonymous comment which shares, I feel empty and tired. It's a little over 2 months since my mum passed. I just feel guilty. I don't know what more I could have done. And on the whole, our relationship remains strong, yet I still feel an unbelievable guilt. My friend tells me grieving is normal and it will pass with time, but I'm not even sure I want it to. The guilt keeps me connected to her. So that word guilt is mentioned at least 3 times in that short paragraph.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many emotions that are connected to grief, and as I've said, grief isn't just after somebody dies. It's also in that, can be, not always, but can often be in the caring process. And when we talk to carers, that's something that comes up repeatedly, is the feelings of grief, whether they recognize it or not. And guilt is can be a part of grief, a really normal part of grief. To be honest, all feelings, there are so many different emotions that are associated with grief. There's not a right way to feel, there's not a wrong way to feel, but emotions are often very, very strong in that time. And sometimes people feel sad, they might cry, but they might not cry. Sometimes people feel numb, they don't feel anything, and then they feel guilty about that because they're not feeling sad enough. Other people feel guilty about specific things, like I wish I had done this better, or I wish I had said this, or beating yourself up. It's a really common reaction. Also, feeling angry is common, feeling shocked, feeling in denial that this can't possibly be happening to me. I can't cope with it. There's so many reactions, but guilt is something that, sometimes people in bereavement have something called survivor's guilt, but also in the caring process, some people have survivor's guilt where, oh, it's not fair, my husband's got dementia, but I'm fine and I feel guilty about being fine. And that's, it's completely normal to feel that, but also it's not rational, because you didn't get a choice in this matter. You never would have chosen it, but it's just of grieving, and somehow your mind is trying to work this out, and you will get through it, but it's really, really difficult. And grief is, so as I was saying, grief, there are so many emotions around grief, and there is no right or wrong way to feel. That what's important is that you notice how you're feeling, and you just look after yourself as much as you can. And as this person that's messaged in, they've said that their friend says it's normal to grieve and it will pass with time, and she's saying, I'm not sure I want it to. And I totally get that. So many carers say that I feel more connected to the person when I'm feeling these strong emotions. I'm actually a bit worried about not grieving, and I'm worried that I will just move on and be all right. And then what does that say about me and how much I care and love the person who's died or is dying, or, you know, it's so complex. And all I would say is that that's really relatable. Like, so many people feel that too. And there's a theory in bereavement work that's called the continuing bonds theory. And that's the idea that when somebody dies, you know, the people who tend to cope really well with the grieving process, eventually, it's always going to be hard at first, are people who still feel they've got some sort of a connection with the person who's died. And I don't mean that necessarily in a spiritual sense, although it could be, but the feeling that I still feel that their life has affected me, and that there are ripples going out from their life. And some people find they talk to the person, other people don't. It doesn't matter, but that continuing bond, you know, there's a quote, death ends a life, but it doesn't end a relationship. And if you can find a way to still feel connected, but it doesn't need to be through the intense feeling of sadness, there are other ways to feel connected. You know, it could be by looking at old photos and smiling sometimes about some of the happy memories. And it doesn't have to be that intense sadness. That's not the only way to feel connected. But I totally get why some people would feel that is the best way, because it's a very intense feeling, and over time it will shift, and that's healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's when you are feeling such strong emotions like you've just described, it's just not easy to be rational about it, is it? And to think calmly about, well, you know, there are other ways. So whilst, you know, what you say makes sense, we know it's really not easy. We have had another anonymous comment in that says, I talk to friends, but they don't really understand, and I can't find any carer groups where I live. So I think in response to that point, I'd just like to remind those of you that are listening today that we do at DCC have a carers support line, which is open Mondays to Fridays 9 till 5, and it's free. It is not a call centre. You will speak direct to a member of our expert services team, and the number is 0800 652 1102, but we will leave that in the comments for those of you that don't know it. So that's 0800 652 1102. So yeah, you know, you may not have carer groups close by, or you may not know about them, but you're really not on your own. Just pick up the phone and speak to somebody that can be a listening ear and maybe offer some advice. Another comment here, Gemima, from Carrie. I lost both my mum and husband. Wow, sorry, Gary. Within a year, that's tough. I don't think that I'll ever recover. How do I know if it's depression? Wow, that's a biggie.
Yeah, I think I'm really sorry, Carrie, that you've had such huge losses so close together. You know, that's huge. And we know that the cumulative effect of grief, you know, having one loss is hard enough to deal with. Having two losses so close together, I can understand why that's affected you so badly. And also, you know, probably I'm imagining you feel that you've lost your support network. You've lost your mum and your husband. You know, those are probably the two most important people that you would have turned to. So it's completely normal that this has really, really affected you. I don't know how long ago this happened for you, but the idea with knowing, I think it's a really important question to ask about grief and depression. They are different, but they can feel very similar. So with grief, we know that you can have intense feelings of sadness. You might well not want to get out of bed, you know, just like you wouldn't if you were depressed. You might well feel hopeless about the future. You might well feel a sense of lack of motivation and just feeling lost and frightened and all of these things. So a lot of the emotions with grief and depression are really, really similar, but there is a key difference. So the key difference is that with normal grief, now there's no timeline. So I'm not going to say, well, after 6 months of having a bereavement, you should be feeling X, Y, and Z, because there really is no shoulds about this. But on the whole, with grief, it does tend to start to move along. So that doesn't mean you feel great after a few months. It's not that, or you don't care as much. But with grief, we have something called the dual process model of grief. Now, you used to think of grief as going in stages. You know, you have your angry stage, you have your depressed stage, you have your denial stage, you have all these different stages. We now know that that is not how people experience grief at all. You might experience those emotions, but you might experience all of those emotions in 1 week. You know, it's much more complex than that. And actually with grief, we have something that looks a bit more like a pendulum that's swinging like this. And you will have, you know, especially at first, you will have most of your time will be in this one side of the pendulum swinging, which is in the bit of about real sadness, loss, depression, feeling like very, very low, feeling worried about the future, feeling overwhelmed. So most of that. But then there will be times when you just come out of it and the pendulum will swing the other way, and you might suddenly be feeling a bit optimistic about something, or you'll watch something on television and it will make you laugh, or you'll come out of it, even if it's just for a few minutes. Over time, you will come out of it a lot more. And you know, if we look at a long time ahead, you probably will find that you are most of the time on this other side of the pendulum where life feels okay, and you're making new plans. But for probably with such significant losses as you've experienced, Carrie, for the rest of your life, you'll have moments where, you know, a song will come on the radio or something will happen that reminds you so clearly of memories that take you back to your loss, that you'll be back there and you'll start crying or you'll feel it, but then you'll come back out of it again. And that's the difference with depression. So grief, we tend to move in and out of it, and over time we move out of it more. But depression, we get stuck. And sometimes grief can coexist with depression. Sometimes we can be grieving and depressed. And if that's the case, if you feel that over a period of, you know, a few weeks, you've not had any time where you've not felt that real intense sadness and lack of motivation, and you just feel really stuck, and if you have a really honest look at yourself, there haven't been any moments where you felt brighter, even just for a bit, then I would suggest you go to your GP. I know it's hard to get an appointment sometimes, but I would suggest you go to your GP and talk to them, because it's possible that this is getting into depression, and get some help, and phone us as well, and you know, and just get some more support. But on the whole, with grief, you will move in and out of it. And I'm just seeing a comment from Lorna. She's saying that there is light at the end of the tunnel. There is with grief.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it, you know, and sometimes it probably never fully goes away, but you kind of experience it not so much with sadness, but as you mentioned earlier, with fond memories, don't you? And I think over time, the grief never really goes away. The fact you miss that person never really goes away. It's just you remember them in a different way, and that leads to a happy memory. And I think you said about maybe listen to a song or hear a song on the radio played that meant something to them or something, and that rather than invoking that immense sadness, it kind of suddenly you find you're smiling at the thought instead.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, everybody's different.
It takes time.
No prescription.
Yeah.
But yes, and also, you know, a feeling of meaning about that person's life. You know, if you have, and I'm talking to carers who are still caring, so their person with dementia is alive still, but they, you know, they've got a life-limiting illness, or they're in bereavement. Either way, it's really important to eventually try and find a sense of meaning about that person's life. So, you know, as I think I might have just touched on it very briefly before, but you know, if you imagine throwing a pebble into a lake, and how there would be ripples that would just kind of go out from that pebble, if it was a big pebble, that's what our lives are like, you know, and it's really important to understand that, you know, the person that you're missing or that you're grieving for whatever stage that you're at, that you realize that their life still has an impact, and what you learned from them, and what you've learned from caring for them, and what you've learned by their their illness, all of this stuff has affected you, and it adds to who you are. And you might feel like, you know, we talked about loss of identity. You might feel like you're not you anymore, but you are still you. But you've gone through something very, very significant, and it might have shifted how you feel about the world. Now that can be really hard and challenging, but there could well be some real added sense of growth in you as a human being eventually too. And I guess if you can navigate your way through that to the point where you can find a way of feeling that, gosh, this person's life, you know, it wasn't all in vain. There was so much good that came from that. And also even from their illness, it was all awful maybe, but also I learned so much, or it affected me. I'll never be the same again, but I've now got this different empathy for people, or whatever it is. If you can get something from that kind of a process, then people tend to cope better in the long run. I know it's hard.
Yeah, thanks, Gemima. That's really helpful advice on what people can do when they are or do feel that they're going through this really, really difficult time. And I'm going to give the last word on the chat box there to Pam, who's said, you know, you can keep people alive with your memories, and it's important to share those memories so that they can live on. Thanks for that comment, Pam. That's really a nice note to sort of start to bring this session to a close on. That's been really insightful, Gemima. Thank you. Before we say goodbye for today, I just wanted to mention quickly about our Walk in My Shoes campaign that started on the 16th of October. And the aim about this campaign is to raise awareness about the many shoes that carers often have to fill. You know, sometimes they might be the carer, but other times in a day they could be the shop worker, or the mother, or the wife, husband, whatever it happens to be. We all wear different shoes throughout the day, and the purpose of this is to raise money for services like our support line that we mentioned earlier. So taking part in it is easy, and you can walk as much or as little as you like, and you can wear silly footwear. The sillier the better is encouraged whilst you're doing it. And we'll leave a link in the comments for you at the end of this session, so you can find out how to get involved if you'd like to do that. So Gemima, would you like the final word?
I would just like to say, if anything that we've talked about today, I know it's an emotional topic. I hope you're all right if you're listening. If there's anything that we've talked about today that's just made you feel like, oh gosh, I really am struggling, please do get in touch, as we've already said. Also, just be aware, like I think that's one of the first steps, is to be aware that maybe this is grief that you're feeling. And just to acknowledge that is a really important step. And then from there, be kind to yourself. You know, and by that I mean, you know, sometimes we can be our own harshest critics. We can be so hard on ourselves, especially as carers. But just know that, you know, you're going through a lot emotionally, physically, everything. So please do look after yourself as much as you can, and find someone if you can to talk to. Sometimes people are really rubbish at knowing what to say when someone is grieving. So if you can, it's sometimes helpful to say to other people, look, I don't need you to give me advice. I don't need you to fix this. I know it's not fixable, but I'd really like you just to listen. And if you can just set that as a parameter with some people, that's helpful, because it takes the pressure off the conversation. They don't need to fix it. They can't. And hopefully that will just mean that they can literally just listen. And that's what you sometimes need, is someone just to be alongside you. So that's what I would say today, is to maybe help people to help you by telling them what they need to do.
Thanks, Gemima. So I hope everyone that's been helpful for you. Again, don't forget the 12:30 session with Dr. Raj and Sue and Chris Maddox, Chris sharing her story there at 12:30 today, if you can make it. But in the meantime, take care, and we'll see you very, very soon. Thank you. Bye.